I am here to talk about my recently completed master's research, the goal of which was to contribute to a better understanding of the nature and extent of Airbnb listings in Vancouver. For those not familiar, Airbnb is a rapidly growing private company founded in 2008. It makes money by acting as a broker between people offering and seeking short-term accommodation, also known as short-term rentals. Oh, sorry. I am not doing well here, but I'm just going to continue. I looked at Airbnb's growth, where listings were located, how much they cost. Yeah, okay, great, thank you. How much they cost, and where they were located. After collecting data for several months and examining it in light of our local rental housing context, I concluded that the unchecked growth of listings poses an obstacle to the city reaching its housing goals, which included the protection of existing rental stock and ensuring that it's possible for people of all ages and incomes to live in Vancouver. So I'll touch very briefly on a couple of my specific findings. There, that worked, that was excellent. I found that the number of total listings grew by 63% over 12 months. That period was from November 2014 to December 2015. In round numbers, the growth was from 2,900 to 4,700 total listings. I also found that listings were concentrated in several core areas of the city, neighborhoods that are not only considered some of the most desirable and amenity-rich areas, but are also where much of the city's rental housing is concentrated, including in the form of rented condos. These neighborhoods included downtown, the West End, Kitsilano, Mount Pleasant, and Fairview. I also looked at average nightly rates for short-term rentals over my study period and how those related to average monthly rents for apartments. To simplify a great deal here, it's reasonable to say that in many cases it was possible to make the same amount of money by renting an apartment to a tourist for about 10 nights as it was to rent it for an entire month to a local tenant. So this sheds some light on the potential financial incentives that platforms such as Airbnb provide for renting to tourists rather than tenants. There was quite a bit more to my findings, but since tonight's theme is innovation, I'll touch on how I gathered the data. In some ways, what I did was straightforward and not especially innovative. I collected data and then I analyzed it by counting, essentially, and creating simple descriptive statistics. However, aspects of Airbnb's website design prompted me to take an approach to data collection that is still fairly new. What I mean here is that Airbnb had designed its website so that the maximum number of results it would return in response to a search was 1,000. That design feature meant that in a city the size of Vancouver, you could not determine the total number of listings just by searching the website. This limitation was part of what made me think that investigating the nature and extent of the listings was a worthy subject of inquiry. I thought that if you could not get an accurate real-time answer to the relatively simple question of how many listings there were in a given city, that would make it hard to ask and answer more complex questions about the newly popular phenomenon of urban short-term rentals and their impacts on housing and cities. To get around these limitations, I turned to a technique that is considered innovative by social science researchers, which is web scraping. Web scraping is a way to automate the collection of data presented on a website using a software script rather than transcribing it by hand. I'm not a software programmer myself, but through one of my fellow urban studies students, I was able to enlist the volunteer help of a local programmer, and he wrote a code that allowed me to collect listing data from the website for several months, basically at will. So that was a turning point in my research design. And I would say that SFU was sort of institutionally innovative here because not only did my own program, the Urban Studies program, support me in the pursuit of this topic and the methods I thought were necessary to do that, but other parts of the university did as well. For example, I had to have my proposal for my data collection methods vetted by the Research Ethics Office. And when I approached them, I really felt that everyone there wanted to ensure my proposal was rigorously reviewed, but equally wanted to support and encourage the public interest goals of my research. There we go. So in terms of research impact, early in my process, I created a blog where I could talk about what I was learning. Then, having collected listing data for several months, in June 2015, I decided to post some of my preliminary findings on that blog. I thought carefully about doing that before going ahead, and I included a lot of discussion about the limits of my data in that blog post. But on balance, I thought it was important and worthwhile to contribute to the conversation about short-term rentals in an informed and timely way, especially because locally I was not hearing a very critical or nuanced discussion of Airbnb or the so-called sharing economy more generally. There turned out to be a great deal of interest in my data, and I ended up doing more than 50 media interviews about my research in the year following that blog post, and being invited to speak about it to the City of Vancouver and even in smaller communities such as Tofino and Ucluelet. I'd also say that now that the city has recently proposed a new approach to regulating short-term rentals, I do see many of the points and recommendations in my thesis reflected there. Certainly others have raised similar issues as well, but I think that by gathering data, doing some in-depth research and being willing to engage about what I learned publicly, I did contribute to the conversation. Suffice to say that my experience with innovation and research at SFU has been rewarding both intellectually and in terms of community impact, and I'm grateful for those opportunities.